As we dive into the movie Darkest Hour, I will reveal 10 historical details that often go unnoticed. So by the end, you'll know the real Churchill, not the Hollywood version. And later in the video, we'll explore the question, did Hitler really want to invade England? By May 1940, Nazi Germany had launched a devastating blitzkrieg across Western Europe. Denmark and Norway had already fallen in April, and now Hitler's forces were sweeping through Belgium, through the Netherlands, and France with terrifying speed. The once mighty French army was crumbling, and the British Expeditionary Force was in full retreat, desperately trying to avoid being cut off by the advancing German panzers. German General Erwin Rommel recounted how the blitzkrieg by his German 7th Panzer Division quickly and easily skirted the French fortification known as the Maginot Line. He triumphantly described how the French troops, their faces distorted with terror, lay huddled in the ditches, alongside the hedges, and every hollow beside the road. We passed refugee columns, the carts abandoned by their owners, who had fled in the panic into the fields. On we went, at a steady speed, towards our objective. A history versus movie detail is that the movie makes it feel like Chamberlain's collapse is mainly a reaction to Hitler's blitzkrieg in the West, but the fuse had already been lit in Norway. In April 1940, Germany launched a surprise invasion of Norway and Denmark, and Britain and France rushed into a messy, poorly coordinated Norway campaign that quickly went sideways. Costly, confusing, and most importantly, embarrassing on the world stage. Within weeks, Germany controlled most of Norway, and confidence in Chamberlain was shattered. The Nazi blitzkrieg across Europe and the disastrous Norwegian campaign has not only caused military defeat in Europe, but has also created a political crisis in London. The British people had placed their trust in Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, but his policy of appeasement had failed spectacularly. In 1938, Chamberlain had signed the Munich Agreement, allowing Hitler to take Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of peace. Chamberlain famously declared he had secured peace for our time, but within months, Hitler had taken the rest of Czechoslovakia, and in September 1939, he had invaded Poland, triggering World War II. As the children of London began their slow evacuation to the relative safety of the countryside, the issuing of gas masks to adolescents further compounded the growing fear. Although children living in the slums, who had never known anything but the streets of London, were excited to go on a holiday to the countryside. Authorities asked parents to drop their children off and say goodbye to them at the schoolhouse gates to limit the emotional hardship on the children. But many parents followed their children, even heartbreakingly chasing after them as they boarded the tube or subway for their journey to the hinterlands. Now, just months later, Hitler was on the verge of conquering France, and Chamberlain's leadership was in question.
Resign! Step down and let us find a new leader!
On May 7th, 1940, frustration with Chamberlain boiled over in Parliament as members of the House of Commons openly attacked his handling of the war. Chamberlain, who had once been widely respected, was now facing a rebellion from within his own party. On May 7th through 8th, debate in Parliament made one thing clear. Chamberlain no longer had the full confidence of the House of Commons. His government survived a vote of confidence, but the results were devastating. Many members of his own party abstained or voted against him. It was not an outright defeat, but it was a humiliating blow. His critics, some calling for his immediate resignation, believed Britain needed a stronger leader to face Hitler. Chamberlain knew that his leadership was untenable, and on May 9th, 1940, he formally resigned as prime minister.
I accept your resignation, but I want you to know how cruelly I think you've been treated.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
The question was, who would replace him? Chamberlain and his political allies favored Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. Now, Halifax was respected, he was experienced, and he preferred a diplomatic approach to Hitler, believing that Britain might need to negotiate peace to survive. He had the support of King George VI, who feared Churchill's impulsiveness, but Halifax refused the job. He didn't want the responsibility of leading the country into war, especially at a time when Britain's chances of survival looked slim. With Halifax stepping aside, there was only one real option left: Winston Churchill. A history versus movie detail. The movie brings in Elizabeth Layton right away as Churchill's secretary. She's basically our eyes inside Downing Street. But historically, she did not join his staff until May 1941, during the Blitz, about a year later. Churchill's rise to power happened after 8 months of relative peace following the invasion of Poland, a period alternately called the Phony War, the Boer War, or Sitzkrieg for the Sit-Down War, a period before Hitler's armies rapidly advanced through various Western nations, including England's chief ally, France. Alexander Cadogan, Undersecretary of the Foreign Office, summed up how many Englishmen felt about Chamberlain's handling of this period, writing, "We are, after years of leisurely preparation, completely unprepared." On May 10, 1940, Churchill was summoned to Buckingham Palace, where King George VI officially asked him to form a government. It was the same day that Germany invaded France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the most devastating offensive of the war so far.
I wish the position had come your way in better times, sir. You have an enormous task ahead of you.
I only hope it's not too late. I'm very much afraid it is. But we can only do our best.
The belief that Churchill was reckless was not a recent invention by his political adversaries. It went back to World War I and his decision as First Lord of the Admiralty to try and break the stalemate on the Western Front. He hoped strategically to outflank the Germans at a place called Gallipoli on the Dardanelles. The plan was solid enough, but its execution was disastrous, causing Australians and New Zealanders to suffer enormous casualties at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. The failure at Gallipoli left a permanent mark of reproach on Churchill, something his political adversaries were more than capable of using as a cudgel against him. Gallipoli also infected Churchill with a measure of self-doubt, as illustrated by his reluctance to attack Normandy later in the war. But this self-doubt did not keep Churchill from speaking out against Hitler. Following the philosophy set by World War I Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey, Churchill believed England needed to make the Germans realize that England was a nation to be reckoned with. A history versus movie detail is that the movie is actually closer to the real Churchill than people expect. His brusque, sometimes abrasive manner, his odd working habits, including dictating from bed and pushing work into every corner of his day. It also gets something more personal right. Churchill's recurring depressive moods, and the way Clementine was not just a supportive spouse, she was often a stabilizer and a corrective voice.
Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of the Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end.
So much to the displeasure of many in Parliament, Churchill railed against the growing threat of Hitler, presciently warning that if German aggression were not checked, the embers of World War I would be stirred anew into another war. But Chamberlain's administration refused to check Hitler's blatant aggression, ironically believing that any attempt to stop Hitler would lead to war. Therefore, Chamberlain gambled appeasement, or turning a blind eye to Hitler's adventurism, was the correct approach, and that Churchill's warnings were to be ignored. The movie shows this philosophical divide continued, even when Churchill took control of the government, with the ghost of World War I casualties causing Chamberlain and Lord Halifax to insist on a brokered peace, rather than on any form of armed resistance. Chamberlain was clearly not a good judge of character, remarking that while he did not care for Hitler's aggressiveness, I got the impression that here was a man who could be relied on. His earlier docile supplication to Hitler's demands that the Czechs surrender part of Czechoslovakia to the Germans mirrored his and Lord Halifax's insistence that Churchill negotiate with the Fuhrer rather than fight him. Germany's blitzkrieg into Poland and eventually all Western Europe would bear out Churchill's prophecy. Adding to his isolation, even the king distrusted him. He had wanted Halifax and was perturbed to be expected to work with Churchill. When Churchill first met with King George VI as Prime Minister, the meeting was cold and tense. Churchill had been a vocal supporter of King Edward VIII, the king's older brother, who had abdicated the throne in 1936. King George had always resented Churchill for that. Now, as Britain faced its greatest crisis, Churchill needed the king's support, but he did not have it yet. Interestingly, both King George VI and Churchill suffered from speech impediments, and both consulted speech experts to correct their enunciation defects.
I believe we are to meet regularly.
Once a week, I'm afraid. How are you for Mondays?
I shall endeavour to be available on Mondays.
4 o'clock?
I nap at 4.
Is that permissible?
No, but necessary.
According to medical doctor John Mather, Churchill struggled with a lisp that caused him to avoid saying the letter S. This quirk led to his famous pause, which became an essential part of his speaking style. The one word Churchill continued to famously and purposefully mispronounce was the word Nazi, which he pronounced Nazis. And then, before Churchill even has time to settle in as prime minister, France begins to collapse. Now, he is Europe's last lifeline. On May 15, 1940, Churchill receives a desperate call from the French Prime Minister, Paul Renaud. "We have been defeated," Renaud tells him. Churchill is stunned. Just weeks earlier, the French had assured Britain that their defenses were strong. Now, their army was collapsing, and Hitler's victory in France seemed inevitable. A history versus movie detail is that the movie uses Renaud's "we're defeated" message to make it feel like France is basically finished in mid-May, and that Britain is already the last man standing. The panic and shock were real, but the French army was still in the field, and the government still formally in the war for another month. The collapse kept unfolding for weeks. Paris fell on June 14, 1940, and the Franco-German armistice was signed June 22, 1940. So the movie captures the terror of the moment, but it also compresses the timeline in a way that can make viewers think France was over earlier than it actually was. With the situation deteriorating, Halifax and Chamberlain see their opportunity. They believe Churchill must consider peace negotiations before Britain is left standing alone. Halifax argues that Britain should reach out to Mussolini, hoping that Italy could broker a settlement with Hitler. The reasoning is simple. If Germany agrees to a deal, Britain could avoid invasion and preserve its empire. Churchill is horrified by the idea. He knows that any deal with Hitler would mean Britain's surrender in all but name. Hitler cannot be trusted. He's broken every promise he's ever made, but Halifax is relentless, arguing that refusing to negotiate would lead to complete destruction. A history versus movie detail is that the movie shows Churchill deeply wavering over whether to pursue peace talks with Hitler, as if he is on the edge of giving in. Historians note that he did consider the mechanics of using Mussolini as a go-between under intense pressure, but the movie has a level of personal self-doubt that's much stronger than the record. He generally held firm that Britain must fight on.
When will the lesson be learned? You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth!
The debate reaches a boiling point during a tense war cabinet meeting on May 26, 1940. Churchill is outnumbered, and Halifax pushes harder than ever. Churchill's position as prime minister is at risk. If he cannot convince the cabinet to stand and fight, he could be replaced. A history versus movie detail is that the movie plays Halifax and Chamberlain as if they are on the verge of a near palace coup to oust Churchill. There was real anger at his stance and serious discussion of Halifax's position, including a threatened resignation. But there's no evidence of a fully formed, imminent plot to topple him the way the movie suggests. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the situation in France was collapsing. The German blitzkrieg had shattered the French defenses, and British troops were in full retreat. Reports flooded in of British and French soldiers being surrounded at Dunkirk, and Churchill was left with an impossible decision. Could Britain save its army, or would they have to surrender? At the same time, Churchill receives devastating news from France. The British Expeditionary Force is now trapped at Dunkirk. Nearly 400,000 British and Allied troops are backed up against the sea, with German forces closing in. If they are lost, Britain's ability to continue the war will be over. Churchill also recognizes how desperately ill-prepared the British people are for the possible coming of German invasion of the British Isles. Supposedly wisecracking to a peer, he said, "And we'll fight them with the butt ends of broken beer bottles, because that's bloody well all we've got." General Sir Edmund Ironside, chief of the Imperial General Staff, believed Dunkirk would become a trap all along. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. Now, as the Germans closed in, Ironside fretted. "We shall have lost practically all of our trained soldiers by the next few days, unless a miracle appears to help us." Any hope for American assistance appeared tragically thin. America's ambassador to Britain, Joseph Kennedy, father of the future President John F. Kennedy, believed that it was actually the British who were maneuvering Germany into another war. And he flatly stated that the British could expect zero support from America. American Secretary of State Cordell Hull believed France's entreaties for help were mere hysterical appeals. Many American diplomats believed that France and Britain were receiving what they deserved for not standing up to Hitler earlier. They reasoned it was not now America's job to clean up their failure. Senator Burton Wheeler went so far as to claim that American assistance for Britain would plow under every fourth American boy. Subsequently, Britain faced its adversaries alone, almost penniless. A history versus movie detail is that the movie turns Roosevelt's position into one big, dramatic, late-night phone call. The emotional truth that Churchill felt desperately alone is captured, but the movie compresses months of political maneuvering, legal workarounds, and incremental aid into one cinematic moment. Though Roosevelt was reluctant to move against American public opinion, nevertheless, he began to quietly move America towards a Lend-Lease system that would allow Britain to survive the early dark days of the war by providing a broke England with war materials and food with little cost up front. Evidence also indicates that Hitler did not want to fight the British, that he saw them as fellow Aryans, worthy of sharing power, and he did not initially feel the need to conquer Britannia. Remarking to a confidant, Hitler stated, "The blood of every single Englishman is too valuable to shed. Our two people belong together, racially and traditionally. This is and always has been my aim, even if our generals can't grasp it." Nevertheless, Hitler was confident that the British would negotiate and surrender as they watched the quick demise of France. Hitler glibly remarked, "England's situation is hopeless. The war is won by us." A history versus movie detail is the movie's famous tube ride, where Churchill suddenly dives into the underground and chats with ordinary Londoners. His pure invention.
Do you know how to use this thing?
Yes, sir.
There is no record of him taking a secret tube trip in May, June 1940. The movie makers have openly described the scene as fictional, designed to show him reconnecting with the public in one vivid scene, rather than through the slower, messier reality of politics and speeches. But Churchill's speeches would be critical to rallying the British people. A government report summed up the feeling of many Englishmen, noting, "Everyone is going around looking as if they want to put their heads into a gas oven." At this critical moment, Churchill makes his stand. He calls for a larger meeting of his full cabinet, where he makes one final argument against surrender. If Churchill loses this room, Britain sues for peace. That day, he rallies his ministers, reminding them of the long history of British resistance, from the Spanish Armada to Napoleon, and he declares that Britain will fight on no matter the odds. Churchill, now speaking softly but boldly to the gathering of his outer cabinet, remarks, "Of course, whatever happens at Dunkirk, we shall fight on." This statement galvanized the leaders, causing them to leap to their feet and surround Churchill with shouts of approval, followed by encouraging pats upon his back. Now, rather than rejecting the teetering leader, they gave him their full support. Churchill proclaimed, "I was sure that every minister was ready to be killed quite soon and have all his family and possessions destroyed, rather than give in." The Prime Minister confided, "I've thought carefully in these last days whether it was part of my duty to consider entering negotiations with that man." But Churchill recognized the gravity of such an act, which could lead to Germany claiming the British fleet and to becoming no less than a slave state and a puppet to the evil Nazi regime. So it was, Churchill assured the Outer Cabinet that we shall go on, we shall fight it out, here or elsewhere. And if at last the long story is at an end, it were better it should end, not through surrender, but only when we are rolling senseless on the ground. And then, with a dramatic Churchillian flourish, he added,
Let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground.
As Hugh Dalton, Minister for Economic Warfare, recorded in his diary, Churchill was the man, and the only man we have, for this hour. When England refuses to surrender, a shocked and angry Hitler decides to put in effect Operation Sea Lion, the plan to invade Great Britain. An incensed Fuhrer remarked, as England, in spite of the hopelessness of her military position, has so far shown herself unwilling to come to any compromise, I've decided to begin to prepare for, and if necessary, to carry out an invasion of England. And if necessary, the island will be occupied. Now, with the War Cabinet fully behind him, Churchill orders the launch of Operation Dynamo, the desperate effort to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. The Royal Navy is stretched thin, so Churchill calls upon ordinary civilians, fishermen, merchants, and private boat owners to sail across the English Channel and help rescue the stranded soldiers. A history versus movie detail is that the film leans into the romantic little ship save the day version of Dunkirk. Civilian craft really did answer the call and played an important role ferrying men off the beaches, but most soldiers were actually lifted directly by the Royal Navy destroyers and larger vessels. And turning Dunkirk into a story of yachts replacing the Navy oversimplifies a massive and tightly organized naval operation. In the book, Eyewitness to History, John Charles Austin's provided a first-hand account on the evacuation from Dunkirk. A group of dead and dying soldiers on the path in front of us quickened our desire to quit the walkway. Stepping over bodies, we marched down the slope onto the dark beach. Dunkirk was now a lurid study in red and black. Flames, smoke, and the night itself all mingling together to compose a frightful panorama of death and destruction. Although Dunkirk is remembered as the great miracle that saved Britain, enabling it to fight on, it was not a miracle for everyone, as countless soldiers were buried in their foxholes by German bombs, drowned waiting to arriving boats, or killed by strafing German planes. Fleeing from Dunkirk was just as dangerous at sea as ships collided, got stuck in sandbars, or were blown up and sank. In one instance, an outfit of British soldiers became so exasperated by the lack of support from the Royal Air Force against repeated German bombings that they turned on a young lad dressed in his Air Force blues and threatened to harm him. Just then, bombs from a Stuka struck, and in the confusion, the man in blue was able to flee. A history versus movie detail is that the movie makes it look as if Churchill personally has a sudden epiphany to send in small boats.
I want you to order an assembly of boats.
Boats?
Yes, civilian boats, as many as you can get your hands on.
In reality, the evacuation plan, Operation Dynamo, was run by the Admiralty and Naval staff, who were already assembling a small vessel pool and coordinating hundreds of ships. His role was crucial in authorizing and backing the operation, but the logistics and idea of using every available craft were already underway. But there were miracles that surrounded Dunkirk. The miracle began when King George VI called for a national day of prayer, rallying the nation with a heartfelt plea, "Let us with one heart and soul humbly but confidently commit our cause to God and ask His aid." On May 26, thousands of British citizens flocked into the churches and synagogues to cry out to God. The miracles included the notoriously churning English Channel proved to be calm and as still as a mill pond, allowing the makeshift fleet of sailboats, yachts, ferry boats, and fishing boats to cross the channel and rescue the thousands of stranded British and Allied soldiers. Another miracle was heavy cloud cover that temporarily grounded the German Air Force, allowed extra time for the small flotilla of English ships and English naval vessels to evacuate far more troops than anyone hoped possible. Hitler listened to Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, who assured him that the German Air Force could single-handedly eradicate the Allied forces trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. So Hitler ordered the heavy armor to stop, something that left the commanders on the ground befuddled and furious. Hitler ignored his ground commander's request to keep going. The decision gave Churchill valuable time to evacuate the beaches. Also, many of the bombs dropped by the German Stuka bombers burrowed deep into the sand, mitigating their impact on the trapped British army below. Ultimately, Hitler's decision to halt his advancing armor provided Churchill with valuable time to evacuate British and Allied forces from the beaches. It's important to note that some historians believe that the hesitancy to send the panzer tanks in for the kill was not simply a foolish blunder by Hitler, but was caused by heavy rain that made traveling through flooded marshes too difficult for armor, and that many of the tanks needed more time for repairs. Whatever the reason, Churchill, who had optimistically hoped for a mere evacuation of 30 to 40,000 soldiers, witnessed the evacuation of over 300,000 soldiers instead. So even Prime Minister Churchill, hardly a religious man, called the successful evacuation from Dunkirk a miracle of deliverance. The name of the movie, The Darkest Hour, is a reference from Isaiah 58:10, which states, "Your darkest hour will be like the noonday sun." The movie title holds a double meaning, referencing both England's dark moment of national survival against the Nazi onslaught and Churchill's personal darkest hour, battling the depression that comes with bearing the weight of saving his nation. Ultimately, in both instances, England and Churchill shine like the noonday sun by effectively and triumphantly resisting Hitler's campaign of European domination. Well, now for the leaderboard. I'm going to take The Darkest Hour and place it just below Patton. I have to admit, I love both the leads in these movies. They're both tremendous actors and deserve great fanfare and credit. I think Patton is just a little bit more sweeping than The Darkest Hour. But I love both these movies, so I hope you enjoyed our look into The Darkest Hour.